if you wanted to hear what is that treason? We all need to know less about each other, Harry. Scrum-diddly-dum-dum. Perfect. I've never once claimed to be a concise human being. I've never once claimed to not be able to chat shit for hours, and that has come through in this video. So you are currently watching the book review video of this. I have also uploaded a reading vlog, should you care to watch the reading vlog. It was all supposed to be one long video, but it was even too long for me, so I decided to upload it into two parts. So if you want to see me reading the book, kind of like me like in the moment, in like the thoughts, the immediate kind of like commentary that I had while I was reading the book, feel free to click the link in the description below and you can watch that video just for ease, just so that like people don't feel intimidated when they see like an hour-long video. So hope you enjoy the book review. Yeah. Okay, welcome to part 2, the book review, commentary, critique, etc. section of the video. I want to say something before I start, and I think saying this is important for me because any comment or critique I make of this book builds from this point, which is the fact that I think everybody has a right to their story and everybody has a right to tell their story, and Prince Harry is not exempt from this. There's been a lot of kind of commentary about whether or not he should have written this book, whether or not it was good, whatever. I think if you wanted to hear what, but like, do you know what I mean? He obviously felt that this was something that he needed to do, and therefore, good on him. I think this for two specific reasons. The first is that I am a historian to my core, therefore I'm a big believer in having things there for the historical record. I think in like 50, 60, 100 years time, should planet Earth still be spinning and humanity hasn't killed themselves off with climate change, this will be really fascinating as a historical text, something for people to look back on, whether the monarchy exists or doesn't exist at that time, to kind of be like, okay, like what was going on, what was interesting. And I think it's good to have the other side of that story, to have his side of the story out there. And then part 2 is the fact that I don't think he owes his family any loyalty just because they're the royal family. I don't think anybody owes the royal family any loyalty because they're the royal family. Is that treason? Will I get my head chopped off? I'm kind of scared of the Tower of London, but I will stand in my truth, and that is I don't think the royal family is owed silence or is owed protection just because they're the royal family. And therefore, people can and should be able to write critique, should be able to write commentary, should be able to write their own story about the institution. Okay, now that we've got that point out of the way with, let's talk about the book. And talking about the book holistically as a whole, first of all, kind of like devolved from any kind of context or whatever. This is a really well-written book. The ghostwriter they got did bits. Honestly, your back must be cracking because you are single-handedly carrying the writing of this book. The use of metaphors, the use of similes, the use of a whole bunch of stuff in this book is just so powerful. What I think I really enjoyed about the book is that it has all these layers of emotions that are threaded throughout the entire like text. So therefore you kind of feel yourself going through the up and down, the rigmarole of all these emotions that Harry must obviously be feeling with him at the same time. And that is just something really powerful that if you can get that done on text, I think bravo. There's a wonderful like imagery in this. There's the descriptions of Balmoral, there's descriptions of like location and place and like world building almost that feels interesting. We've all seen kind of the outside of Balmoral or whatever, but like it's really interesting to be like, okay, well, like these 2 bedrooms looked like this, and like the bed had Elizabeth's like crest thingy on it. Like all those kinds of details I think are like important because obviously they were important to like him, especially like the descriptions of Balmoral as a child. Like those are obviously things that he remembers, and so like it's really interesting to get those like descriptions. Something else that I think is really interesting through the book is the way that motifs and themes just play out again and again. It's like the idea of being spare. Side note, whoever at Penguin greenlit that title, you deserve a raise because that title perfect. Anyway, the theme of spare running throughout the book, the way that it's like built on over and over and over again, powerful. Another really powerful thing that I think comes through the book is the theme of grief and the way in which it grows and goes with Harry throughout his entire life, and the way in which the book feels almost sandwiched, covered in themes and motifs of grief. that you almost understand that like grief becomes this kind of like constant companion for Harry throughout his entire life. I thought that was super duper powerful. I think it's like really interesting. So the book is set in 3 parts. The first part is part 1, which follows Harry from the death of Diana up until kind of like his late teen years, like early adult years, where he joins the military. So like his education, all that kind of stuff. Part 2 takes you through his time in the military, leaving the military, and then kind of becoming a full-time working royal and kind of almost becoming William and Kate's third wheel. Part 3 takes you through the Markle years, from them meeting, falling in love, getting married, to like Megxit and like the ultimate departure from being full-time working members of the royal family. And so all those like different chapters all have a theme of grief that runs throughout. The way that like it honestly, it was like really powerful. It's like you're introduced to the book with William and Charles and Harry having a conversation just after Prince Philip's funeral. So like you start and you're already in the throes of being like, okay, like grief, and then you kind of go straight into the death of Diana, and then kind of like him processing or not processing all those things. And then there's other instances like his childhood friend dying, you've got Caroline Flack dying, you've got them having a miscarriage, the Queen dying. There's also like the like shadow of death that like hangs about like his time in Afghanistan, and like people dying, and like all those very like tiny stories almost build consistently on this theme of grief, which I think was just so powerful. I appreciate how brave it was. I think it's like a really interesting thing to write about grief, because like I don't think, you know, it ever goes away. And so for somebody to just like be so like bold to be like, yeah, okay, like look, this is how I haven't dealt with my grief, this is how I did deal with my grief, I thought that was really interesting, really brave. So then yeah, you're invited to, as part of his grief is his anger. So the main antagonist of the book is the British media, the British press. Harry has very palpable anger towards them. And he tries to make explicitly clear that this is a anger that's been there forever. This is an anger that stems from childhood, and it just kept on growing and growing and growing, and so that like metastasized into this like just angry ball that Harry was constantly like felt some type of way about. What's really interesting in this positioning of the British press as the main antagonist is the way that he almost gives his family an out. And I'm not saying out in like a bad way, but in terms of like, he then positions his family as almost victims of the system. Something he tries to make very clear is the fact that like his family equally dislike the press, but see them as almost like a necessary nuisance, you know, like they're annoying, they're terrible, but they have to work with them. It's for the good of the monarchy, for the preservation of the institution that they work with these companies. And so what Harry tries to do is he tries to position himself righteous with like a righteous anger away from this, saying, I don't want to work with the press in the way that my family works the press. I don't want to feed them stories. I don't want kind of I don't want that kind of relationship with them that my family has. And he tries to almost be like, but my family thinks they have to have these relationships. And so William especially, and also Charles, are almost given an out in this. They're kind of given the position of being like, oh, you know, well, they don't really have the liberty of having to rebel because they are going to see the throne. So I think it's really interesting that the way in which like he absolves his family of some of like, I don't know, whatever. I feel like if you go into it, you're almost like invited to absolve William and Harry partially. Not William and Harry, William and Charles. The only person you're not invited to absolve pretty much in this entire book besides the British press is Camilla. He really Cinderella's himself in Evil Stepmother's Camilla. He's like, yeah, no, this woman knew exactly what she was doing because she is a person that can use the press and has used the press for years to try and get her way. I found that really interesting, like directly positioning Camilla with the press and all the things that she does, her advisors, all those kinds of like really like sly moves that she apparently makes. Like at one point, William and Harry are trying to figure out, or like Harry sees a story in the news and he's like to William, well, this was only the two of us, like what happened? And William's like, oh, I might have like let it slip to Dad and Camilla. And so like in that moment you're like, oh well, Camilla is the villain, or like part of the villain. Like really interesting, really bad press for Camilla. That's all I'm going to say. Especially because Diana is constantly described as this, like, light, this ethereal, like, good human, like, perfect, wonderful, right? And then there's just Camilla being evil, and, like, Diana hates the press. Diana is good. It positions Diana as, like, well, she hated the press. She'd have never worked with them this way, da-da-da. But Camilla would. Really interesting, I personally thought. But yeah, I think the way in which you're invited to feel about the British press is very fascinating to me, because, like, they are truly, in his eyes, the villain. And this is not me saying that I agree with the British press. Absolutely not. Like, fuck Rupert Murdoch, fuck The Sun, fuck News of the World, even if they don't exist anymore. But, like, you are invited to take part in his anger, to feel like, okay, well, maybe things wouldn't be so bad. Maybe the institution wouldn't be so bad. Maybe all these relationships would still exist, would still be intact if it weren't for the awful, awful British press. Which is a really interesting lens to take, I think, to be like, all the problems, all of the fights, all of the arguments, they definitely stemmed from how the British press was covering it. It was them that were positioning Meghan to be uppity or to be like unapproachable. It was them that were like pitting Kate and Meghan against each other. It was them. And so they're the reason for the rift. And that's who you're invited to paint as the antagonist. And I think it's a really interesting way to try and, like, not portray William and Kate as villains, to maybe try and convince people that Harry and Meghan aren't villains, to be like, oh, I think we can all agree that it was the press's fault. Like, William and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the press. I thought that was quite fascinating in terms of whatever. Another thing I thought was interesting is the ways in which Harry really tries to lay the foundation to be like, look, cracks have always been there in relationship because that's what happens in family. So, like, Meghan doesn't really play a main part. Obviously, she's there in chapter 3. They're talking about the happy times, But something that I found very interesting was to be like, some of these cracks were building off of the back of previous things that were mentioned. Like in part 1 and part 2, you've kind of got, like, the competition between the heir and the spare, to talk about how William maybe wasn't always the most, like, loving and present brother, that, like, he always had a bit of, like, a competitive spirit to him, that he always wanted to be the best because he was the heir. So, like, a lot of those seeds are planted in the first kind of, first section, second section, in a way that then when you get to the third section and you see William being competitive again, you see him kind of, like, throwing fits. Is fits the right word for it? No. Throwing, like, tantrums, that's, like, a word for it, about the way in which maybe Harry and Meghan are behaving or conducting themselves. Then you kind of can, like, think back and be like, oh, well, when you were at Eton, yeah, no, that's how he behaved. Which, fascinating, like, stance to take on, like, a brotherly relationship, to be like, look, it wasn't just Meghan that caused this rift. Like, there's always been a tiny bit of competition, and then to position the British press as, like, the reason that the rift kind of, like, really grows. Really interesting. I also think that this does interesting PR for William, because William kind of comes off as, like, unfortunate bystander in the fact that he's the heir, in the fact that, like, he has to do all of this. Like, he has to shave his beard for his wedding, he has to do things a certain way for his wedding, he has to do this, he has to do that, he's got no choice but to do it. And so I think it actually interestingly does some, like, press for William, because he almost then becomes an unfortunate product of his consequences, whereas Harry maybe has more option, because as soon as William has a child, he's the spare. So fascinating. IMO. Like, I don't know, I just thought that was a really interesting thing. Obviously there is lots of discussion about family and falling out in this book. Like, you can't get away from it, especially in, like, the third section, or even in the first couple of pages. Like, you kind of start with Harry being like, you guys know why I left, you guys have to understand, and Charles and William are like, we don't understand. So, like, family and falling out plays, like, a huge role in this book. And personally for me, I think if Harry really has a problem with his family, then he should sort things out the old-fashioned way. He should convince France to fund him, raise an army, invade, and, like, seize the crown. That's the true British monarchical way to sort out a family dispute. Like, it just is. I don't know. I thought it was just a really interesting, the way in which family is explored in this book. the way in which they're all given nicknames. It's never William and Charles. It's Willie and Pa. It's Mummy. It's Mummy. It's Eugenie's novel, like Eugenie. It's like Huge. All these people, like, they're all given nicknames, and so, like, I feel like by doing that, he's trying to be like, look, I'm not talking about maybe like public figures. I'm not talking about Prince William. I'm talking about Willie, my brother. I'm not talking about King Charles. I'm talking about Pa, my father. It was really interesting. I don't know, very fascinating to me. Okay, we'll talk about a few other things before I guess I get into my last point. First of all, Soho House. I have never met the love of my life in Soho House, or like had a date in Soho House or whatever, anytime I've gone. And I want to know why. I'm quite angry about it. So if somebody's son does want to take me to Soho House, let me know, because that's where Meghan and Harry's love really blossomed, in a Soho House. So like if somebody's son does want to take me to a Soho House, preferably the farmhouse, let me know, okay? My email is down in the description below. Another thing, Meghan Markle is undoubtedly a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful woman, right? Whatever. Undoubtedly a beautiful woman. The type change from like dating English roses to dating Meghan Markle just really made me laugh. You go from like Chelsea and Cressida to it tickled me. But yeah, that's one other thing. And then another thing is that there's a lot of genitalia related imagery in this book that I don't know if I was like here for. I got to a point where I was like, we all need to know less about each other, Harry, and you need to lead that, because like, why am I reading or listening to you talking about like rubbing Elizabeth Arden on your like frost-bitten penis? I don't care. I truly, well and truly don't care. The cynic in me is like, it was an attempt to add like levity, to add some humour, to add a break, a reprieve. The cynic in me really wants to say that, like, especially in chapter 2, there's a lot of heavy imagery on, like, Afghanistan, on killing people, operating drones, etc. And so, like, part of me is like, did you do this to, like, take people out of it a little bit? You were like, oh, like, killing, but guys, how funny, I actually once got frostbite on my penis. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I just don't necessarily think we all needed to know that. The other thing is the fact that he, on multiple occasions, refers to his penis as a todger, which made me think, fucking... like, be fucking for real. A todger? Yeah. And then finally, let's talk about the thing that I think is the biggest takeaway for me from this entire book, and it is the positioning of racism in the book. There is no doubt that Meghan Markle suffered horrendous racism and misogyny at the hands of the British press, and maybe unconscious bias from the royal family. There's no doubt about that. However, there is this subtle thing I think that's done for me in the book, which is Harry talks about like his Nazi uniform scandal, like using the P word, all of these things, right? But they're almost like covered in like boyhood innocent, like, oh, like I didn't think about it, like it was just what was done, whatever. So you position him almost as like this boy who did racist things, and then there's this positioning of him as like taking a stand against the racism, like confused why other people aren't confronting racism, almost like becoming an anti-racist ally. And you're supposed to like, I feel like you're supposed to like see that growth from being like, oh wow, he's learned so much, he's done the work from being the boy who would wear a Nazi uniform to now standing up to the British press and the royal family about racism. Like, I feel unconscious, like subconsciously, you're supposed to like think that's the journey he's done. But for me, what I found throughout the book was that I was just like, yeah, and the book positions the way in which Meghan Markle suffers racism as an individual issue rather than a systemic issue. So this is happening to Meghan and Meghan alone. There is no attempt to connect Meghan's real life experience with racism as a system, which I find slightly problematic because of the way in which the book has been advertised and the PR that Harry's doing, especially when he's like, oh, you know, I'm really doing the work. And I feel like when he says I'm really doing the work, I feel like he bought like Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, or he bought Me and White Supremacy, but then used them as coffee table books. like, never been touched, never been opened, but, like, he has them, and he can say he's got them. Ally. And so a few times just comes out for me is, first of all, in the way in which he talks about Botswana, and his relationship to Botswana. So a lot of the time he goes to Botswana as an escape. He's got 2 friends there, or like that, like he like lovingly like calls he calls one of them mum, or like something like that. He goes to Botswana. Botswana is only ever described for its natural like plain, right? And he has a very extractive relationship with Botswana. So he goes there when he needs a break. He goes there when he needs da-da-da. But it's never a reciprocal relationship. So he hardly ever talks about the people of Botswana. He never talks about like encounters that he has there that makes him love the place, besides the fact that like it's pretty. And that it feels like a very extractive relationship to have. And it feels like almost a manifestation of the relationship that like the Crown has always had with Botswana. It's take, never really gives anything back. And this is something that he has called out on by like the 2 people that he always goes to visit. They're like, what can you actually do for the country? And I think that's a really important thing. Like, you can't keep using former colonies as your own respite, as your own shelter when you need them, while never really giving anything back to them. Part A. Part B, while we're talking about empire, is that like there's one point where he mentions the Kohinoor, the diamond. And he's like, oh, Britain acquired it, some would say stole it. He has almost like an awe. He's like, oh, wow, I love the Kohinoor, but like it can only be worn by women or whatever. And part of me is like, open a book, like just a singular book on the British Empire, just one, and read a couple pages. Because to use the word acquired, problematic. This happens again. He says that the people might disagree with the monarchy because the way in which they acquired the lands was unjust. Unjust feels like a bit of a minus. It's like it feels like an understatement, you know? Oh, it's just a little bit unjust. No, 400 years of like colonialism, all of it. Like, I feel like unjust just feels like a bit of it's like a minor sentiment. Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? And so it's really interesting to then hear him like talk very righteously about the racism that Meghan suffered, which is awful, like horrendous, terrible. I'm not denying that, but it's really interesting to him talk about how awful it was when she was suffering this, and how much he's had to learn, or like how much that he stood up and was like, enough is enough, right? But there's never actually an attempt to make a connection between the racism that Meghan is suffering and the racism that like is completely entwined in British culture. And maybe I'm asking too much from Prince Harry. Maybe I am. But this is my channel. This is the critique I'm going to make, and this is the commentary I'm going to make. And it's that Harry is single-handedly, actually double-handedly, because that doesn't make sense. Harry is in one hand trying to offer critique of racism, right? While also trying to preserve the monarchy, while still adoring the monarchy, while still not making criticism of the monarchy as an institution. And those 2 things don't go together. They just don't. Yeah. And it feels really interesting because, like, rather than acknowledging the monarchy's centuries-long contributions to the plight of many countries, the takeaway seems to feel like, oh, if only they'd accepted this, if only they'd used this, we could have worked together. And I'm like, BFFR, babe. What were you going to work together to do? What? And I get it. Looking to a prince to do any critique of the monarchy, to do any critique of a system that he's benefited from his entire life, I was asking a lot. But I'm going to put this out there that supporting the monarchy and being anti-racist are 2 incompatible things. So at one point Harry says, my problem has never been with the concept of monarchy, but babe, it should be. The concept of monarchy has single-handedly relied on certain aspects, certain tenets that are part and parcel of systemic racism, not to mention the fact that the monarchy upheld systemic racism through colonialism for generations. Also, like, you're still benefiting from those things, all those lands, all those jewels, all those crown state, all of that, right? It's still a product of colonialism and racism, and so support for the monarchy and anti-racism are incompatible. I'm going to leave you with this, because for me, ultimately, Harry and Meghan are doing all of this, right? As well as Harry. Not because they want to dismantle systemic racism or colonialism or the institution of monarchy or anything like that. They're doing it because they weren't accepted by it. And for me, that begs the question, what if they had been embraced by them? What if they had been embraced and accepted by the royal family, by the British press? Would they still be happy and willing to participate in a racist and imperialist institution? And for me, the answer is probably yes. Because people want to have conversations on racism and give them NAACP awards and give them anti-racist allyship awards, whatever it is, right? But we truly have to ask ourselves the question, would they still be talking as loudly and as proudly about racism if they were still in the royal family? If they were still being accepted, if they were still working, if they were still all smiles and giggles, would we be having these conversations?